Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on challenges to Jim Crow, 1930 to 1950. In this conversation, we're going to look at the new ideological consensus that developed in the 1930s that really challenged a lot of the things that we have been talking about with regard to white supremacy and racist ideology. And then we're going to also talk about the economic crisis of the Great Depression and the response to the Great Depression, which was the New Deal, and the challenges associated with that situation to Jim Crow. And then we're going to thirdly look at World War II and the rise of the new militancy. And so we're going to see in this conversation that a new ideological consensus, an economic crisis and a response to that crisis, and World War II are going to combine to create very significant challenges to the Jim Crow system that has existed since the 1800s, and that occurred in the context of about the period 1930 to 1950. So, as we look at this new ideological consensus, this new way of thinking that developed in this period in the 1930s, I want to ask the question: how does environment influence individual behavior? How does environment influence how humans behave? We've seen a lot of conversation about uh, people believing in what they called innate characteristics and intrinsic inferiority and all of those kinds of things. Now we want to take some time and really work through how does environment affect the behavior of human beings? How does your environment affect your behavior? What do you see in the world when it comes to the influence of environment? John Locke wrote a book called Essays Concerning Human Understanding, and he's kind of the forerunner of the idea of the importance of environmental influences on human behavior. He's actually a thinker from the 1600s. Many of his ideas are incorporated into our American Revolution. They are some of the basis of what we call classical liberalism. So they're very influential in American history. And what he said way before the 1930s was, let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence comes it by that vast store which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted on it, with an almost endless variety? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this answer, in one word. To this I answer in one word, from experience. So Locke is saying basically that the mind of a human being at birth is a blank slate. It's a white piece of paper. There's nothing on it at all. And that essentially experience, the knowledge we acquire from living, the experiences of interacting with our environment, write something on that blank slate that makes us who we are, that determines our behavior. So long before we get to the 1930s, where there's going to sort of be a consensus thinking on develop on environmental influences, John Locke was talking about this centuries before. Michael Harrington, in his book The Other America, kind of elaborates on this idea of the importance of where you're born and what your life looks like on human behavior. He said, but the real explanation of why the poor are where they are is that they made the mistake of being born to the wrong parents, in the wrong section of the country, in the wrong industry, or in the wrong racial or ethnic group. Once that mistake has been made, they could have been paragons of will and morality, but most of them would never even have had a chance to get out of the other America. So he's identifying an America that is not wealthy, not successful, an America that is poor and not privileged. And he's saying that if you're born in that America, you are not going to jump into the other America. You're not going to do that. You're not going to get out of it. And so he's taking the idea of Locke, making it very specific to here's what happens in life. You're born here, you're raised in this situation, um, the race you are, the income level that you are, the neighborhood you live in, the part of the country, all of that ultimately determines your destiny as a human being and would ultimately determine um, your behaviors. So the new ideological consensus is going to line up with the thinking of John Locke and Michael Harrington. And it's going to emphasize the idea that environment is more important than innate characteristics, that essentially um, they accentuated the influence of the environment over how a person develops and over how they think and how they act. And basically, these thinkers said that there is tremendous damage done to an individual by prejudice, and the cost to the nation of discrimination are uh, terrible as well. So they're going to argue that there is prejudice and discrimination in our world, and we let it exist. And as long as we let it exist, damage is going to be done to individuals, it's going to be done to our country. It's done to individuals who are being discriminated against. It's done to individuals who are the discriminators as well. It hurts everybody, and it hurts our nation as well. And so these people are going to start to argue, let's change that environment. Let's change the way things are. Let's make a better environment and we'll get a better outcome of human behaviors. And so this way of thinking, this importance of environment and this de-emphasis on innate characteristics obviously is going to undermine white supremacy and some of the ideology that we've talked about. And it's going to demolish the idea or the stereotype that blacks are contented where they are because that's where they're supposed to be. The old way of thinking, the white supremacist thinking based in innate intrinsic inferiority said that blacks are at the bottom because that's what they're made to, that's where they're made to be. It's where they fit. It's where they're supposed to be, and it's natural, and there's nothing you can do about it to change it for the better. This is going to blow that idea up, and this is going to say it's not the place for them. It's not, they're not contented to be there. They're not in the right natural place, and we need to do something about that. And so you're going to create a situation as a result of this new thinking that puts white supremacy on the defensive. White supremacy is going to now have to begin to rethink how it responds to these new lines of attack against its ideology. And so one very interesting response to all of this is what we see going on in Christian colleges. Again, this is an intellectual movement. It's in the academic community primarily. And as a result, within the Christian academic community, you're going to see some movement in the 1930s, especially the 1940s. So in that period, you're going to see Pepperdine University, which was formed in 1937. It's a fundamentalist college. It is going to allow black students for the beginning of its history right away. It's going to allow black students. But for the first 10 years, they weren't allowed to live on campus, but it did admit black students. The Southern Baptist Theological University, I'm sorry, the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary is going to allow black students for the first time in 1951. I'm sorry, 1940. It's been around since 1859, as we know. And it's not until 1940 that they allow black students, and they're not fully integrated until 1951, but we're seeing movement. The famous Catholic University, Notre Dame, it allows black students in this era. And but to show you the other side, there's the fundamentalist university called Bob Jones University. It's not going to allow black students until 1971. It is founded in 1927. So they're going to come along much slower. But we do start to see change. We do start to see some adaptation to the new way of thinking within Christian colleges. So the new ideological consensus is going to shift the paradigm on the way we think about race in this country. And it's a really important thing that begins occurring in the 1930s. Um, Also very important is the economic crisis of the 1930s and the response to that crisis, the Great Depression and the New Deal. And so the question I want to ask in relation to that conversation is, how would economic crisis affect the vulnerable? We've already seen that Black Americans were in a situation in which their reality was sharecropping, segregation, and the denial of the right to vote or disfranchisement. And so they're vulnerable. We don't have any question about that. They are placed economically, socially, politically at the bottom of society in the Jim Crow era. And that's now existed for more than 60 years. Um, how would economic crisis affect people who are vulnerable? Does economic crisis affect everybody the same way? Does it affect the prosperous the same way that it affects the poor? Does prosperity affect everybody the same way? Does it affect the poor and the rich the same way? Does economic crisis affect everybody the same way? That's a good thing for us to consider as we consider the economic crisis of the 1930s. Lawrence Glasgow answered this question in his essay Double Burden, The Black Experience in Pittsburgh, when he wrote, "The effects of economic stagnation and racial discrimination were visible in the deplorable living condition of the migrants. As they poured into Pittsburgh during and after World War I, the migrants settled mainly in the Lower Hill District, the most densely inhabited section of the city, and characterized by a housing stock already old and dilapidated. Doubling up, with men on night shifts sleeping in beds vacated by day workers, caused an unsatisfactory situation to deteriorate even further. Health conditions and crime rates reached scandalous levels. Tuberculosis, influenza, whooping cough, scarlet fever, and venereal disease plagued the community. The death rate soared, and crime rose 200%. So Glasgow is saying that in Pittsburgh, the black migrants into the city were severely affected by the racial discrimination and economic stagnation that occurred there. And so he helps to really frame our understanding of kind of the reality of what this looks like on the ground for the vulnerable. So the Great Depression, again, resulted from the stock market crash of 1929. And the severity of it is almost impossible for us to comprehend. 25% of Americans overall were unemployed as a result of this depression. People were losing their homes. Banks were going under, and they were losing their savings in the banks. And this is a crisis that goes on for like a decade. What's really striking for our conversation is that while unemployment in general went to 25%, black unemployment in the country during the Depression went to 50%. Why did that occur? Well, one of the reasons is that discrimination in jobs kept blacks in the lowest paid positions in the city. So Lawrence Glasgow does some more work on this, helping us to understand what happened. And that is that because of World War I, for the first time, blacks could get jobs in the steel industry in Pittsburgh. But because of discriminatory practices, they couldn't move up in those jobs. And so when the Depression came in the 1930s, they were still in the lowest level jobs. And so those are the first jobs to go. And so the first to lose their jobs in the Depression were often black workers because of these discriminatory practices. And so the Depression is going to have severe consequences for black Americans, different than for white Americans. So the major response to the Great Depression was the policies of Franklin Roosevelt. and his program of what we call the New Deal. And so the New Deal is real important in that it is going to create some very important advancements for Black Americans. There's going to be about 100 blacks appointed to administrative posts within Roosevelt's administration. He's going to make some very significant movement forward. He's going to triple the number of black federal employees. Roosevelt is going to desegregate federal restrooms, cafeterias, and secretarial polls. He's going to make appointments to the Supreme Court that of justices who are sort of favorable to social justice issues for Black Americans, and he's going to have a cabinet, some advisors within his administration that come to be known as the Black Cabinet. These are Black leaders who meet with Roosevelt to advise him on government policies that would be helpful to the Black community. So I show this to help you understand. Look at the difference between this Roosevelt and the first Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson and Herbert Hoover, and some of the things that we talked about with regard to them. This is groundbreaking and very, very significant stuff. Some very important advances during the New Deal. But as almost always is in our story, there are also setbacks. And one of the major setbacks of this period is the New Deal's um, advocacy of segregated housing, its choice uh, to use the federal government to discriminate in people's ability to own a home. And so to understand that, we have to understand that it's in the 1930s. Like, again, lots of people are losing homes. So the government wants to help with that. So they create the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which helps people that are losing their home because they lost their job, they can't pay their mortgage. They're helping people to be able to keep their house by providing a favorable loan, so that a guaranteed loan, so that they can refinance uh, their home and not lose it. So that's what the Homeowners Loan Corporation does. The Federal Housing Administration, a different organization, was created to help people buy a home, to help people to like encourage the building of homes and encourage Americans to move from renters to owners of homes. And that's a great idea. And one of the things they did was to offer mortgages that were guaranteed by the government, and very different than any mortgages before. I mean, at this time, not that many people, white or black, owned their own home. And that's because to get a mortgage on a house, you normally had to have about half of the cost of the house as a down payment. The mortgage itself was usually about a 5 to 7 year term, and the payments you made over that term were all interest payments. The payments we make now include on home mortgages include some principal, but in this case they were just on interest. So at the end of the 5 to 7 year period, you had to pay off the loan because you still owed everything you borrowed, because no principal had been paid. It was all interest on the loan. And so the government comes in and says, well, what if we offered people and worked with the banks and the real estate agents and offered people a mortgage that is a 20-year mortgage or 15-year mortgage? And what if we amortize so that the interest on the loan was included in the payments, but there was also some principal being paid down? And what if we reduced the down payments? And what if we gave a better interest rate? And so this is a monumental moment in American history, because what we're going to start doing is encouraging people to buy homes and creating a process in which the federal government is going to come alongside of that. Now, here's the really sad part of this. The government set up a policy that essentially um, kept blacks from accessing these loans. That policy becomes known as redlining. We have a picture of it here. Essentially, when they went into cities to try to figure out, this is a picture of Los Angeles, to try to figure out who to make these loans to, they color coded the city, and they put neighborhoods in that were black neighborhoods in red. And they essentially said these neighborhoods are high risk neighborhoods. We're not going to loan to people who live there. and we're not going to give people, loans to buy a house there, and we're not going to give people that live there loans to buy a house somewhere else, because the federal government believed that if you put black people in white neighborhoods, you will reduce the property value of the homes, and so you will get the exact opposite result of what you're trying to accomplish by helping people to own their own homes. And so they were not able to buy their own homes. You also have the government building housing projects for the first time in the 1930s and 40s. And when they do that, they are also building housing projects for Black Americans and white Americans. So the federal government is going to make a decision in the 1930s as part of the New Deal that we're going to have segregated neighborhoods in this country. And that's going to have devastating consequences. It's also going to shut large number of Black Americans out of opportunity for home ownership. Richard Rothstein covers all of this in his excellent book, The Keller of Law, which I highly recommend. So some really significant developments as a result of the economic crisis and the response of the New Deal. Now, as we transition to World War II, we're going to see another major event in this period that's going to be disruptive, and it's going to create its own set of responses. And one of those responses within the Black community is going to be the rise of Black militancy. So my question is, why would we see Black militancy at this time? I want to think about that for a second. We've been looking at, in these conversations, we've been looking at um, racial issues in America dating all the way back to the 1600s. We've looked at centuries now. We've looked at 3 centuries of race relations. We've looked at 3 centuries of oppression, of slavery and discrimination and all the things that we've talked about. And the response by Black Americans to all of that in general is overwhelmingly passive. There's almost no examples of violent response. And if there is violence in race relations, it is almost always white violence perpetrated against Black Americans. In fact, I think it's fair to say there's been an enormous amount in those 3 centuries, an enormous amount of violence perpetrated by white Americans on Black Americans, and almost no violence perpetrated by Black Americans on white Americans. Now, that's not to get confused and to say that the new Black militancy is all about violence, because it's not. But there are going to be elements of violence that start to emerge here. But the new Black militancy is going to be about people saying enough is enough. And we are going to do things in protest that we have not done before. Why would Blacks become more militant at this particular time? Anne Braden, in her book, The Wall Between, said this: there are only 2 ways to cope with it, segregation. Either you build a little life for yourself within the wall, you shut away part of yourself and say, this is the way it must be, or you beat your head against it, lashing out blindly, destroying yourself, but not the wall. For it can't be crashed through, not from your side alone. Or maybe there's a third alternative. You find gates through the wall. You find that it is not a vast, gateless expanse. You find there are ways through it, and people on the other side willing to meet you there, people who will work with you to take it down brick by brick. I think Anne Braden really, sets this up in a really helpful way of frustration that exists. You can be frustrated with segregation, and you can look at that wall and you can say, there's nothing I can do about it, and you can just accept it and kind of internalize your frustration. Or you can try to smash it down, and most likely with very little effect. Or you can look for doors in the wall, and you can look for people on the other side that will work with you to help to bring down that wall. It's a very interesting response. Now, whether or not you can knock it down without that help is a great question, and I'm not sure that Braden is correct that that can't be done. But what is clearly true is that Black Americans decide that passively accepting the wall is no longer what we are going to do. At least a great number of Black Americans. It's not going to be a majority right away. It's going to take time for this process to uh, to unfold. But there's going to be Black Americans that are going to rise up and say, we need to fight against this wall. So one of the things that occurs in World War II that kind of brings that process on is the Second Great Migration of 1941 to 1970, initiated again by war. We saw the First Great Migration in World War I. Same basic situation. You have opportunity for jobs, people going off to fight, black soldiers, white soldiers, jobs open up, people can go work in the industries. They come back from war, they can go work in industries. It's all kinds of opportunity. And so you see the lines of migration. You see some of the lines to the old towns, but you also see a lot of new places where people are going. You see Minneapolis and St. Louis. You see San Francisco and Los Angeles and Oakland out west. You see Black Americans moving from the south into the north because of opportunities. There's people moving in general from farm to cities. We have to understand that this movement is a move from farm to city, from the rural south to the urban centers of the north. And in that process, it freed people from a very isolated, rural, rigid caste system, and it intermingled people in new and different ways. And that large numbers of people in new arrangements and new living arrangements fostered group consciousness and solidarity. It allowed people to get a sense of themselves that was different. It's very similar to the 1920s and what we talked about there, and it's going to ultimately develop new norms and beliefs because of this movement of people. So the Second World War, 1941 to 1945, is going to create a situation in which Black Americans are going to have an opportunity to seize the moment and kind of step into a new conversation. And the reason for that is that the government had a tremendous need for loyalty and manpower. We had to fight a two-front war, war with Europe, war in Europe, and a war in the Pacific. And because of that, we needed to mobilize our industry. We needed laborers. We needed soldiers. And so we needed everybody on board to fight this war and to be victorious. And so Black Americans kind of seized the moment and said, okay, great, we want victory. We want victory without, which is in Europe and in the Pacific, and we want victory here at home, what they call the double V, the double victory at home and abroad. And they cast it in terms of democracy. You know, we're fighting in the world for democracy. We're fighting here for democracy, for people, all people in America to be treated the same, to have the same social and economic and political rights. And so it's at this time that the NAACP grows in membership by 10 times larger than it was. So lots of Black Americans join this movement so that they can advocate more strongly and in more solidarity for their own rights. A new organization is formed in 1942 called the Congress of Racial Equality, and they advocate nonviolent direct action to protest Jim Crow laws. So that this is kind of a new idea, nonviolence, but direct action, civil disobedience, protesting Jim Crow in a very clear way. James Farmer and Bayard Rustin are the founders of CORE. It's going to be a very important civil rights organization going forward. So the double V becomes the call of Black Americans and many white Americans as well during World War II. One of the major results of this movement for the double V is going to be the end of discrimination in war industries. The leader of this movement is a man named A. Philip Randolph. He was a socialist, and he was leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a union, and that union had its own magazine called The Messenger. And what Randolph did was he used that platform to essentially organize what he called a March on Washington. And in 1941, he said, we're going to march on Washington to protest racial discrimination in war industries, segregation in the military, anti-lynching laws, and other things. And so that March on Washington was very problematic to Franklin Roosevelt. And so, in response to that threat, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which banned discrimination in war industries and created the President's Committee on Fair Employment Practices. And the result of that was that 2 million jobs for Black Americans are ultimately going to be created. And so 2 million Black Americans are going to be able to get jobs that they didn't have access to before. So this is a huge step forward. Now, it's only war industries. It's only where the government is involved, but it's a huge step forward for Black Americans. And the result of that is that Randolph cancels the march, kind of as an agreement, which is good for Roosevelt, and Black Americans get the end of discrimination in war industries. Now, as always, though, there's pushback whenever progress is made in race relations in American history. We can see that throughout. And where we see that in the 1940s and during the war is the race riots of 1943. And so, just to give you some context, a couple of them, the Detroit riots, the city constructed a housing project for blacks in a white neighborhood. Whites protested, there was a confrontation, there were rumors passed around, and there was a riot. And there had to be 6,000 federal troops called in to end the rioting. In Harlem, a World War II vet, Robert Brandy, he's a Black American, had an altercation with a white police officer. He struck the police officer, and as he was fleeing the scene, the officer shot Robert Brandy. Blacks end up attacking white property in Harlem as a result of that incident. And so I want you to see the context here. I want you to see the evolution. Now we've seen mostly white violence on Black Americans for much of our conversation, but now we're starting to see both. We're starting to see race rioting from both sides more of the race divide. This particular series of events frightened Black leaders to the point that they began, Black newspapers and Black leaders and Black civil rights groups began what they called good conduct campaigns, encouraging people to be nonviolent, encouraging people not to riot and not to be involved in racial altercations. To give you a sense of where the Black populace is at this time, 71% opposed the March on Washington. Every Black newspaper in 1943 spoke out against A. Philip Randolph's call for civil disobedience against Jim Crow. And ultimately, even CORE's direct action program failed in the 1940s. So we see this interesting rise of the new militants among Black Americans, but also kind of a receding of that and a stepping back into past responses because of not wanting to go too far, which is a very interesting part of this conversation for us to understand. Some of the pictures here in this frame are of some very famous things involving these different riots that we talked about. After the war is over, the war is going to lay the foundation for some really important gains, and it's also going to create some setbacks. One of the greatest gains is the Executive Order 9981, signed by Harry Truman in 1948, which desegregated the armed forces. It's a huge development. The armed forces had been segregated since the Civil War, and finally in 1948 we said we're going to integrate the armed forces. I can't express how important that's going to be in affecting American society as Black and white soldiers go off to war and interact with each other, or go off to the military and interact with each other in ways that they never did before, and come home and say, you know what, we don't have to live separated. We can live in closer together. We can integrate our society. So this is a huge decision. There's also integration in baseball, Jackie Robinson. Um, there's also integration in science and other areas. Dr. Charles Drew, during the war, actually discovered the mechanism for which we can store blood, and ended up to be in charge for a time of the process of um, that very important process within the Red Cross of storing blood so that we can save soldiers' lives and people's lives. Um, Drew ultimately resigned his position because of the policy of not mixing blood that was donated by white and black Americans together, but instead keeping it segregated, which is like really, really messed up if you stop and think about it, but where the struggles that America is still having at this period. Another post-war gain is growth in the American economy, which is going to help all levels of society, black and white. And there's also the decline in credibility of racist ideas. The excesses of Nazism, a white supremacist ideology, the decline of Western imperialism. There's African countries that are seeking and gaining their independence in the post-war years. All of these are things are going to kind of reduce this the environmental influence and the decline of the idea of innate inferiority. All of these things are going to kind of add together to say maybe racist ideology is not the norm. Maybe that is not the best way to look at things. And so that's going to continue throughout this period. And there are very influential books written. Gunnar Myrdal wrote the book An American Dilemma that are going to address these issues. So that's a gain. There's going to be a response as well by white supremacists. They're going to adjust themselves because it's going to be harder and harder in this space that we're now in to make racial arguments if you take away the innate argument of innate inferiority. And so what white supremacists are starting to say is if you are protesting against our American system, that's un-American. If you don't like the way things are in America, you're not an American. And they went to the extreme of saying, you must be a communist because the perception of this era, and there's a lot of fear of communism in America at the same time, is that to not be an American is a communist. That if you are opposed to anything about America, you must be a communist. That's the way people are defining the world at this time. And so that is going to be kind of an adjustment that's important, that's going to be important in our coming conversations. And then lastly, we're also going to see a very important development or setback in the administration of VA loans and the building of what we call the Levitt towns. Um, so in 1944, the federal government passed what's called the GI Bill, and it was designed to help vets coming back from the war, which there were millions of them, to transition to living in regular society again. And so there was like money in there to train people for jobs, which African Americans were only trained for the lowest, African American vets were only trained for the lowest jobs. There's money to help you start a business. There's money for education. Again, there's discrimination against African Americans that exists there. But the most critical thing probably is the massive program to help vets get loans through the Veterans Administration. And so the same principles I talked about with regard to mortgages that we've already looked at is applied here, but very specifically for returning vets. And there's actually a kind of process developed in which there is cooperation with builders, real estate agents, local communities, and the federal government. And essentially, what we're doing is building entire suburban neighborhoods with the idea of helping vets buy a home there. And so there are tons and tons of thousands of vets that are helped to be able to get a home. Some of these neighborhoods that are built are called, developments are built are called Levitt towns. And so what you need to know though is that the VA for the most critical early years, denied Black Americans the opportunity to get these loans. Black Americans could not get the loans. And as a result, white Americans got these beautiful homes at very good interest rates in neighborhoods where the property value, where they're buying a home for $7,000 that today would sell for probably $300,000. Developing equity, building wealth, and Black Americans are shut out from it. And it's a really critical and devastating choice of what we did here, a choice of what we did to our returning Black veterans. So in this conversation, we've looked at these key challenges to Jim Crow between 1930 and 1950. The new ideological consensus, which challenged the idea of innate inferiority and said environment is what determines who we are and the way we act. And then there's this economic crisis and response that gets the government kind of moving on racial issues. And there's World War II, which opens up this opportunity for Black Americans to say, yes, we will fight in the war. Yes, we will work in the war industries, but we want treated fairly. We want that double V. And there's that movement to the north that's going to open up new possibilities. There's the end to discrimination in war industries. There's the violent response since 43 with the race riots. And then there are the post-war gains and setbacks, in particular, the end of discrimination in the military, but at the same time, the denial of those VA loans to Black veterans. So some takeaways from this conversation. A new ideological consensus developed in the 1930s that accentuated the influence of environment over innate characteristics, stressed the damage done to individuals and the nation by discrimination, and demolished the idea of the contented Black American. The Great Depression hit Blacks harder than other groups, and Roosevelt's New Deal gave Blacks opportunity in federal jobs, but denied them opportunity in property ownership. World War II and the migration of Blacks to northern cities brought about a new militancy among Blacks that created new opportunities to protest, racial solidarity and consciousness, and led to both race riots and access to jobs in war industries. The post-war era saw both gains and setbacks for Blacks, including integration of the armed forces, housing discrimination, white flight, the decline of racist ideology, and the use of anti-communism by white supremacists to thwart Black equality. Some questions to consider. What does Scripture say about how environmental influences affect human behavior? Should we expect people to sacrifice financial advantage for Christian principles? Was it Christian for Black Americans to use the war as a means of achieving justice for themselves? Thanks for joining our conversation today. God bless you, and have a great day.